I pulled my 15-year-old grandson from foster care. 17 years later, he's the surgeon who saves the woman who hurt him. At 15 years old, Ethan had already learned how to survive on his own. He had grown up in a small, worn-down apartment where silence and shouting lived side by side. Some days were quiet, heavy with tension, and other days exploded without warning. His childhood did not feel like something soft or safe. It felt like waiting for the next thing to go wrong. He learned early how to stay out of the way, how to read moods, and how to disappear into himself when the air turned sharp. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. His mother, Laura, had not always been cruel. There were faint memories from when he was very young. Her laughing in the kitchen, singing along to the radio, holding him close while watching old movies. But those moments slowly faded as her addiction took over her life. What started as long nights out turned into missed school mornings, unpaid bills, and strangers coming and going from their home. Ethan stopped inviting friends over when he was 10. By 12, he stopped talking about his family altogether. Laura's moods were unpredictable. Some days she was overly emotional, crying and apologizing for things she could not name. Other days she was angry, sharp with her words, and careless with her actions. She did not hit Ethan often, but her words landed just as hard. She called him ungrateful, useless, and a burden she never planned for. Ethan learned to accept those words as truth, even when they burned inside him. Food was not always guaranteed. There were weeks when the fridge was empty except for old leftovers and spoiled milk. Ethan learned which neighbors sometimes left doors unlocked and which stores threw out food late at night. He learned to stretch meals, to eat slowly, and to tell himself hunger was just another feeling that would pass. At school, teachers noticed his tired eyes and quiet behavior, but no one pushed too hard. He was well behaved, never caused trouble, and slipped through unnoticed. As Laura's addiction worsened, her relationships became more dangerous. Men came and went, some loud and careless, others quiet and watchful. Ethan learned which ones to avoid and which ones might offer him a ride or a meal. None of them stayed long enough to matter, but all of them left behind damage. Arguments often ended with broken dishes or slammed doors. Once, a neighbor called the police after hearing shouting late at night. That was the first official report. Social workers began visiting after that. They spoke softly and took notes while Laura promised she was getting better. She cleaned the apartment before each visit and acted calm for an hour or two. Ethan stayed quiet, afraid that speaking up would make things worse. He did not trust the system. He had seen how quickly promises fell apart. But the reports kept coming, and the visits became more frequent. The night everything changed started like many others. Laura came home late, unsteady and angry. She accused Ethan of stealing money, even though he had not. Her voice grew louder, her words sharper. When he tried to leave the room, she threw a glass against the wall. It shattered inches from his face. Something inside Ethan finally broke. He locked himself in the bathroom and called his grandmother. Margaret had always been the quiet strength in Ethan's life. She lived alone in a small house on the edge of town and kept her life simple. She called every Sunday and sent birthday cards with handwritten notes. She knew Laura struggled, but she had hoped things would improve. When Ethan called her that night, his voice shaking and small, she knew hope was no longer enough. Margaret arrived before the police. She stood between Ethan and his mother, her voice calm but firm. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She simply refused to leave without her grandson. When the authorities arrived, the decision was clear. Laura was taken in for questioning, and Ethan was placed into temporary care. As he packed a small bag, he felt numb rather than sad. Leaving felt like relief mixed with guilt. Foster care was nothing like he imagined. The first house smelled like cleaning products and rules. He was given a room, a schedule, and instructions that felt cold and distant. The foster parents were not cruel, but they were not warm either. They treated him like a responsibility rather than a person. He followed the rules, kept his head down, and counted the days without knowing what he was counting toward. Ethan moved through 2 more foster homes within 6 months. Each place had different rules, different expectations, and different ways of reminding him he did not belong. Some kids acted out. Ethan did the opposite. He stayed quiet, polite, and distant. Teachers described him as respectful but closed off. Social workers noted his lack of emotional response. No one seemed to realize that numbness was his way of surviving. He stopped expecting adults to stay. Every goodbye reinforced the idea that attachment only led to disappointment. When asked about family, he shrugged. When asked about his feelings, he said he was fine. Inside, he carried a mix of anger, sadness, and fear that he did not know how to express. Nights were the hardest. He often lay awake, replaying memories and wondering what he had done wrong. Most relatives kept their distance. Some believed Laura deserved another chance. Others did not want the responsibility. Phone calls went unanswered, and promises were quietly forgotten. Ethan overheard one conversation where someone said he was too damaged to take in. That sentence stayed with him longer than anything else. Margaret refused to accept that answer. She attended every meeting, filled out every form, and asked every question. She was told her age might be an issue, that raising a teenager would be difficult. She listened carefully, nodded politely, and continued anyway. To her, family was not something you abandoned when it became inconvenient. When Ethan was told he might be placed with his grandmother, he did not react at first. Hope felt dangerous. He had learned not to trust good news. But when he arrived at her house, something felt different. The space was small but warm. The air smelled like soap and fresh tea. Margaret hugged him gently, not too tight, as if she understood he needed space. Living with her was an adjustment for both of them. She had routines and expectations, but they were rooted in care rather than control. Meals were simple but regular. She asked about his day without pushing too hard. When he stayed quiet, she accepted it. When he spoke, she listened fully. Slowly, the tension in his shoulders began to ease. Still, the past did not disappear. Ethan struggled with trust and anger. Small disagreements felt bigger than they were. Margaret remained patient, reminding him that mistakes did not make him unlovable. Some nights, he heard her crying quietly in her room, worried about Laura and scared of failing him. They were both healing in their own way. The decision to take Ethan in was not easy for Margaret. It meant giving up her quiet life and facing painful family history. But it was never a question of whether she would try. Watching him settle into her home, even slowly, reminded her why she made the choice. He deserved safety. He deserved a chance. Ethan did not know it yet, but this was the beginning of a long road forward. The damage from his past would take time to untangle. Trust would come slowly. Pain would resurface when he least expected it. But for the first time in years, he was not alone. And sometimes, that was enough to keep going. As weeks passed, the system continued its evaluations. Laura entered treatment, promising change once again. Ethan listened to updates with mixed emotions. Part of him wanted to believe. Another part stayed guarded. Margaret never spoke badly about his mother. She allowed him to feel whatever he needed to feel without judgment. By the end of that year, Ethan began to understand something new. Family was not just about blood or obligation. It was about showing up, staying present, and choosing care even when it was hard. He did not say these thoughts out loud, but they shaped the way he looked at the world. This chapter of his life was built on loss, pain, and difficult choices. But it also carried the first quiet signs of hope. A broken family did not have to stay broken forever. Sometimes, all it took was one person refusing to let someone disappear. Margaret had not planned to start over at this stage of her life. In her late 50s, she had settled into a quiet routine. Her days were predictable, and her evenings were calm. She believed she had already done the hardest work of raising a family. But when Ethan entered foster care, that sense of peace no longer felt right. Every quiet moment reminded her that her grandson was alone, moving from place to place, carrying pain no one else seemed willing to carry with him. The process to bring him home was harder than she expected. It was not just one form or one meeting. It was months of paperwork, interviews, background checks, and court hearings. Each step felt like a test, as if she had to prove again and again that love and commitment were enough. Some officials were kind and encouraging. Others were distant and cautious, warning her that taking in a troubled teenager could be overwhelming. Family members did not make it easier. A few quietly questioned her decision. They told her she was too old, that she deserved rest, and that Ethan needed professionals, not family. Some blamed Laura's mistakes and said the situation was not Margaret's responsibility. She listened without arguing, but inside she felt firm. Turning away from Ethan was not an option she could live with. Ethan, meanwhile, waited without expectations. Foster care had taught him not to hope. Every placement felt temporary, and every promise felt fragile. When he was told his grandmother wanted custody, he assumed it would fall apart like everything else. He packed his duffel bag slowly, unsure if it mattered what he took with him. Most of his belongings were replaceable. He had learned not to get attached. The day he arrived at Margaret's house was quiet. There was no big celebration or emotional speech. She met him at the door, smiled softly, and helped carry his bag inside. The house was small but clean, with simple furniture and warm light coming through the windows. It did not feel fancy or new, but it felt steady. That steadiness made Ethan uneasy. At first, the transition was rough. Ethan struggled to sleep. Nightmares woke him suddenly, his heart racing, his body tense. Sometimes he wandered the house in the dark, unsure where he was. Margaret noticed the creaking floorboards at night but did not question him in the morning. Instead, she left the porch light on and made sure the hallway lamp stayed lit. His anger came without warning. Small things triggered big reactions. A simple reminder to do homework could turn into silence or sharp words. Once, when Margaret accidentally raised her voice, Ethan froze, his face closing off completely. She realized then how deep his fear ran. From that moment on, she chose her words carefully, even when she was tired or frustrated. There were days when Ethan barely spoke at all. He answered questions with shrugs or single words. Meals were quiet. Margaret resisted the urge to fill the silence. She understood that forcing conversation would only push him further away. Instead, she focused on being present. She cooked regular meals, kept routines steady, and showed up every day, no matter how distant he seemed. School was another challenge. Ethan struggled to focus and trust teachers. Authority figures made him tense. Margaret met with counselors and explained his history without sharing more than necessary. She asked for patience, not special treatment. Some teachers understood. Others did not. When problems arose, Margaret handled them calmly, showing Ethan that conflict did not always lead to punishment or abandonment. Slowly, small changes began to appear. Ethan started sleeping longer stretches at night. The nightmares did not disappear, but they became less frequent. He began eating more regularly, finishing his meals instead of leaving food untouched. One evening, he laughed quietly at something on television. The sound surprised both of them. Margaret celebrated these moments silently. She did not point them out or draw attention to them. She knew how easily progress could be undone by pressure. Healing, she believed, needed space and time. Some days felt hopeful. Other days felt heavy and discouraging. She learned to accept both without giving up. Ethan tested boundaries without realizing it. He expected anger, punishment, or rejection. When those reactions did not come, he felt confused. Once, after an argument, he waited for Margaret to send him away. Instead, she knocked on his door later and asked if he wanted dinner. That simple act stayed with him longer than any lecture. Trust did not form quickly. It came in fragments. A shared meal. A ride to school. A quiet evening sitting in the same room. Ethan did not talk about his past, but it lived in his body and reactions. Margaret never pushed him to explain. She believed that when he was ready, he would speak. Court hearings continued in the background. Custody was not finalized right away. Each meeting brought stress and uncertainty. Ethan feared being taken away again. Margaret reassured him without making promises she could not keep. She told him the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. Honesty became one of the foundations of their relationship. Laura's situation was discussed often in official meetings. She entered treatment and spoke about change. Ethan listened from a distance. His feelings toward his mother were complicated. He felt anger, sadness, and guilt all at once. Margaret allowed him to feel all of it. She never spoke badly about Laura, but she did not excuse her actions either. As months passed, the house began to feel more lived in. Ethan's shoes rested by the door. His school papers cluttered the kitchen table. His presence slowly filled the space. Margaret adjusted her routines to include him. She learned what foods he liked and which ones reminded him of hard times. She paid attention to what made him tense and what made him relax. There were setbacks. Some nights, the nightmares returned stronger than before. Some days, Ethan's anger pushed them both to the edge. Margaret had moments of doubt, wondering if she was truly equipped for this role. When those thoughts surfaced, she reminded herself why she started. Giving up was not an option. One evening, during a particularly difficult week, Ethan asked a simple question. He wanted to know if she was going to send him away when things got worse. Margaret answered without hesitation. She told him she was not going anywhere. The words felt heavy, full of responsibility, but they were true. That night, Ethan slept through without waking. It was not a miracle or a turning point, but it mattered. It was one more brick laid in the foundation they were building together. Trust, he was learning, did not arrive all at once. It grew quietly, shaped by consistency and care. By the time custody was officially granted, Ethan no longer felt like a guest in the house. He still carried pain, but he also carried something new. Stability. Safety. The knowledge that someone had fought for him, even when it was difficult. Margaret did not see herself as a hero. She saw herself as a grandmother doing what family was supposed to do. But for Ethan, her choice changed everything. Being pulled from foster care was not just a legal decision. It was the moment his life began to move in a new direction. The road ahead was still uncertain. Healing would take years, not months. There would be challenges they could not yet imagine. But this chapter was about survival turning into hope. A small home, steady routines, and one person's refusal to give up were slowly rewriting Ethan's story. Life with Margaret settled into a steady rhythm. It was not exciting or dramatic, but it was predictable, and that mattered more than Ethan realized at first. Each morning followed the same pattern. He woke up at the same time, ate breakfast at the small kitchen table, and left for school with his bag packed and lunch inside. The sameness felt strange. Chaos had been familiar. Order felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Margaret believed structure created safety. She did not explain it in long speeches or lectures. She showed it through action. There were set times for schoolwork, chores, meals, and rest. The rules were clear and consistent. When Ethan followed them, life moved smoothly. When he did not, there were consequences, but they were calm and fair. There was no shouting, no silent treatment, and no threats of abandonment. At first, Ethan pushed back. He forgot chores, ignored homework, and tested limits without realizing it. Part of him expected anger or rejection. When those reactions did not come, he felt confused. Margaret corrected him firmly but gently. If he missed a chore, he did it later. If he skipped homework, he lost screen time. The response was always the same, steady and predictable. School remained difficult in the beginning. Years of instability had left gaps in his learning. He struggled to focus in class and often felt behind his classmates. Sitting still for long periods made him restless. Instructions sometimes felt overwhelming. When teachers spoke quickly or changed expectations, his chest tightened with stress. He worried they would label him as lazy or difficult. Margaret stayed involved without hovering. She checked his assignments each evening and asked simple questions about his day. When he said school was fine, she accepted the answer. When he admitted it was hard, she listened without judgment. She did not solve every problem for him, but she helped him break big tasks into smaller steps. One teacher began to notice something different about Ethan. During science class, he paid close attention. While he struggled in other subjects, his focus sharpened when experiments or explanations were involved. He asked thoughtful questions and remembered details others missed. When the class worked on a simple project, Ethan stayed engaged long after most students lost interest. The teacher pulled him aside one afternoon, not to correct him, but to encourage him. She told him he had a strong analytical mind and a natural curiosity. The words caught him off guard. Praise was unfamiliar and uncomfortable. He nodded politely, unsure how to respond. Still, something shifted inside him. For the first time, someone saw ability instead of damage. At home, Margaret noticed the change. He talked more about science class, even explaining concepts at dinner. She listened carefully, asking questions that showed genuine interest. She did not exaggerate her praise, but she acknowledged his effort. She reminded him that skills could grow with practice and patience. Ethan began spending more time on schoolwork, especially in subjects that challenged him. Progress was slow, but it was real. He learned how to study instead of giving up. When he made mistakes, Margaret encouraged him to try again. Failure, she told him, was not proof that he could not succeed. It was part of learning. Chores became another source of growth. Margaret assigned tasks that matched his age and ability. Washing dishes, taking out trash, and helping with groceries were simple responsibilities, but they carried meaning. Completing them gave Ethan a sense of contribution. He was not just someone being cared for. He was part of the household. Discipline remained firm but respectful. Margaret believed boundaries showed care, not control. When Ethan broke a rule, she addressed it directly. There were no long arguments. She explained the reason behind the rule and the consequence that followed. Over time, he began to understand that rules were not traps. They were guidelines meant to protect him. Evenings were often quiet. Sometimes they ate together and talked about the day. Other times they watched television or read in the same room. Silence no longer felt threatening. It felt peaceful. Ethan started sleeping better, waking up rested instead of exhausted. His body slowly adjusted to a life without constant stress. There were still difficult days. Certain sounds or situations triggered old memories. Loud voices at school made his heart race. Arguments between classmates made him tense. When this happened, he sometimes shut down or grew irritable. Margaret noticed these moments and responded with patience. She reminded him to breathe, to take breaks, and to use words when he could. One evening, after a rough day, Ethan lashed out over something small. He expected punishment. Instead, Margaret waited until he calmed down. Then she spoke clearly and honestly. She told him his feelings were valid, but his behavior needed to change. She made it clear that anger did not excuse hurting others or himself. That conversation stayed with him. No one had ever separated feelings from actions for him before. He began to understand that emotions did not control him unless he allowed them to. This idea gave him a sense of power he had never felt. Margaret often repeated one rule more than any other. She said it calmly, never as a threat or demand. Your past does not get to decide your future. At first, Ethan brushed it off. The past felt heavy and permanent. But as weeks passed, the words began to sink in. He started to imagine a life beyond survival. The idea felt risky. Hope always had. Still, small thoughts crept in. Maybe he could do well in school. Maybe he could build something stable. Maybe he was more than the sum of his mistakes and pain. The science teacher continued to encourage him, offering extra help and resources. Ethan accepted them cautiously. When he did well on a test for the first time, he stared at the paper in disbelief. The number felt unreal. Margaret celebrated quietly that night with his favorite meal. She did not make a big show of it, but she let him know she was proud. Discipline at home remained consistent. When he slipped, the response was the same as always. Calm correction. Clear expectations. No shame. Over time, Ethan internalized the structure. He began setting his own reminders and managing his time more effectively. Responsibility no longer felt like a burden. It felt like proof of growth. Trust deepened slowly. Ethan asked more questions about life, about work, and about the future. Margaret answered honestly, sharing lessons she had learned without preaching. She encouraged him to think critically and make his own choices. One afternoon, Ethan stayed late at school working on a project. When Margaret arrived to pick him up, she saw him through the classroom window, focused and determined. The sight filled her with quiet pride. She did not say much on the drive home. She did not need to. Healing was not fast or simple. It did not erase the past. But stability and discipline gave Ethan tools he had never been given before. Structure taught him control. Encouragement taught him confidence. Consistency taught him trust. By the end of that year, Ethan no longer saw himself only as someone who survived. He began to see himself as someone who could build, learn, and grow. The rules in Margaret's house had done more than keep order. They had given him space to become something new. The journey ahead was still long, but the foundation was strong. Each day of routine, discipline, and care quietly shaped his future. And for the first time, that future felt open, not trapped by the past. By the time Ethan reached the final years of high school, the fear that once followed him everywhere had softened. It did not disappear, but it no longer controlled every decision. Life with Margaret had given him something steady to stand on. The routines, the expectations, and the quiet belief placed in him had shaped the way he saw himself. He was no longer just trying to get through the day. He was thinking about what might come next. School became a place of focus rather than tension. Ethan still struggled in some subjects, but biology felt different. The human body fascinated him. He wanted to understand how things worked beneath the surface, how damage could be repaired, how pain could be eased. When lessons moved into anatomy, his attention sharpened even more. He stayed after class, asked careful questions, and read ahead on his own. Teachers noticed the change. His grades improved steadily, not suddenly, but enough to stand out. Counselors began talking to him about college, a word that once felt distant and unrealistic. At first, Ethan listened politely without taking it seriously. College seemed like something meant for other people, people with support and money and clean histories. Margaret never pushed the idea. She simply asked what interested him. When he spoke about biology and medicine, she listened the same way she always had, fully and without judgment. She did not tell him he should be a doctor. She did not tell him he could not be. She let the idea grow at its own pace. The decision to aim for medicine did not come from ambition or status. Ethan did not imagine prestige or praise. What drove him was quieter and deeper. He had seen damage left untreated. He had lived inside pain no one noticed or understood. The idea of learning how to fix what others broke gave him purpose. Applying to colleges was overwhelming. Forms, deadlines, essays, and financial worries stacked up quickly. Ethan balanced school with a part-time job, saving what he could. Margaret contributed in her own quiet ways. She cut back on small comforts, delayed home repairs, and worked extra hours when she could. She never spoke about sacrifice. She treated it as normal. Scholarships became essential. Ethan applied to as many as possible, often doubting himself as he wrote personal statements. He struggled to talk about his past. Some advisors encouraged him to share his story, but he resisted. He did not want pity or sympathy. He wanted to be chosen for his effort and ability, not his pain. When acceptance letters began to arrive, the moment felt unreal. The college he chose was not famous or prestigious, but it offered strong science programs and financial support. It was enough. More than enough. Margaret cried quietly when he told her. Ethan did not. He simply nodded, as if accepting a responsibility rather than celebrating a victory. College life tested him in new ways. The workload was heavy, and the pace was fast. Many students around him seemed confident and prepared. Ethan often felt behind, unsure if he truly belonged. Doubt crept in during late nights and long study sessions. He reminded himself of Margaret's words. Your past does not get to decide your future. He worked part-time throughout college, balancing classes with shifts that left him exhausted. Some semesters were harder than others. There were moments when quitting felt tempting. In those moments, he thought of the years spent simply surviving. He knew how to endure. Now he was building something. Medical school felt like a distant dream until it was suddenly real. The application process was even more demanding. Interviews were intense. Expectations were high. Ethan approached each step with quiet determination. He did not exaggerate his strengths or hide his weaknesses. He spoke honestly when asked, carefully choosing which parts of his story to share. When he was accepted into medical school, the weight of the moment took time to settle. Margaret hugged him longer than usual. She did not say much. Words felt unnecessary. The years of effort, sacrifice, and steady belief had led them here. Medical school pushed Ethan harder than anything before. The hours were long. The pressure was constant. He watched classmates struggle, burn out, or lose motivation. He struggled too, but for different reasons. His drive came from a place deeper than competition. Every lecture felt like a step closer to being useful in the world. He found himself drawn to anatomy labs and clinical settings. The human body no longer felt abstract. It felt personal. Each case reminded him that behind every patient was a story, often hidden. He treated everyone with quiet respect, never rushing, never dismissing concerns. Professors noticed his focus and discipline. Throughout these years, Ethan rarely spoke about his mother. He did not mention her in interviews or conversations. That chapter of his life felt sealed away. He believed it was necessary to move forward. Looking back felt dangerous, like reopening a wound that had finally closed. Margaret never asked him to talk about Laura. She understood silence as a form of protection. She continued to support him from a distance, sending meals when she could, calling regularly, and reminding him to rest. Her sacrifices continued quietly, without recognition. As graduation approached, Ethan reflected on how far he had come. The boy who once lived in fear now walked hospital halls with purpose. The journey had not been easy or fair. He had worked harder than many, fallen more times than most, and carried weight others never saw. Choosing a path in medicine did not erase his past, but it gave it meaning. The pain became fuel, not a prison. He believed he had closed the door on the life he left behind. He believed the past was settled. What Ethan did not know was that some chapters wait patiently to be reopened. For now, he focused on the future, trusting the path he had chosen. Against the odds, he had built something strong. And he believed, perhaps for the first time, that it would last. 17 years passed quietly, the way hard-earned stability often does. There were no sudden miracles or dramatic turns, just steady progress built one choice at a time. Ethan became known as someone reliable, someone who did not panic when things went wrong. In the operating room, his hands were calm, his focus sharp. Pressure did not shake him. Chaos no longer ruled him. He had learned how to stay steady when others faltered. As a surgeon, Ethan earned respect not through loud confidence but through consistency. He prepared carefully, listened closely, and treated every patient as a person rather than a problem. Nurses trusted him. Younger doctors sought his guidance. Patients often commented on how safe they felt around him, even when facing frightening procedures. He spoke plainly without false comfort, but with honesty and care. Compassion came naturally to him, especially with patients others found difficult. Those who were angry, afraid, or withdrawn did not push him away. He recognized the signs. He knew what fear looked like when it hid behind silence or sharp words. He never rushed them. He never took their behavior personally. He understood that pain often spoke louder than reason. Outside the hospital, Ethan lived a controlled and quiet life. His apartment was neat, his schedule precise. He exercised regularly, cooked simple meals, and avoided unnecessary distractions. Friendships were polite but limited. Relationships remained distant. He did not let many people close. Emotional distance felt safer than vulnerability. It was a boundary he had built carefully over time. Margaret followed his life from a distance, the way she always had. She attended graduations, read articles that mentioned his work, and listened to updates during phone calls. She never demanded attention or praise. Watching him succeed was enough. She understood the cost of every step he took, even when others saw only the outcome. They spoke often, but not constantly. Their conversations were comfortable, filled with everyday details rather than emotional confessions. Ethan checked on her health, made sure she had what she needed, and visited when he could. She never complained about being proud. She showed it in small ways, the way she always had. Ethan believed he had earned his life. He had worked for it, protected it, and shaped it with intention. The past felt distant, almost unreal. Foster care, fear, and instability belonged to another version of himself. He rarely thought about his mother. That chapter felt closed, sealed away to protect everything he had built. Then came an ordinary shift that became anything but. The emergency department was busy, filled with noise and urgency. Ethan was finishing paperwork when a call came through for a critical case. The details were brief. Severe trauma. Immediate surgery needed. He moved without hesitation, slipping into the focused calm that defined him. When the patient was brought in, Ethan reviewed the chart quickly. He noted age, injuries, and vital signs. Names rarely meant anything in moments like this. What mattered was action. The room filled with movement as the team prepared. He took his position, ready to begin. Then he heard a voice. It was weak, strained, and familiar in a way he could not immediately place. The sound cut through his concentration like a sharp edge. For a moment, his hands stilled. He looked again at the patient's face, older now, worn by years of struggle. Recognition came slowly, painfully. It was his mother. The distance he had built shattered in an instant. Years of emotional control strained under the weight of memory. Faces, words, nights of fear rushed back without warning. His chest tightened, and for a brief moment, he struggled to breathe. The room waited. The team looked to him for direction. Training took over where emotion threatened to overwhelm. Ethan steadied himself. He did not step away. He did not ask for someone else. He focused on the patient in front of him, not the past attached to her. He gave clear instructions, his voice calm despite the storm inside. The surgery was complex and risky. Mistakes were not an option. Every movement mattered. He worked with precision, pushing personal thoughts aside one moment at a time. Hours passed before the procedure ended. When it was finally over, exhaustion settled into his bones. He stepped out of the operating room and removed his gloves slowly. Only then did the weight of what had happened begin to settle. Ethan stood alone in the hallway, staring at the floor. He felt anger, sadness, and confusion all at once. He had spent years believing this chapter was closed. Now it stood open, demanding attention. Later, when he spoke to Margaret, he did not hide the truth. He told her what happened in simple terms. She listened quietly, her voice steady. She did not tell him what to feel or what to do. She reminded him that saving a life did not mean reopening old wounds unless he chose to. Ethan did not visit his mother's room. He ensured she received proper care and handed the case to another doctor for follow-up. Distance, he realized, was not cruelty. It was protection. He had already given more than he owed. In the days that followed, he reflected on the life he had built. He realized that compassion did not require sacrifice of self. Strength did not mean forgetting the past, but it did mean not being controlled by it. 17 years after leaving foster care, Ethan understood something clearly. His life was not defined by what had been broken. It was defined by what he chose to build. Education, discipline, and care had carried him forward. Love, given freely and steadily, had changed his path. Margaret had been right all along. The past did not decide his future. He did. As Ethan returned to work, his calm remained, but it carried deeper meaning now. He was not just a surgeon who fixed bodies. He was someone who had healed himself enough to choose who deserved space in his life. The emergency had shattered distance, but it had not broken him. His life was earned, not given. And that knowledge stayed with him, steady and unshakable, as he continued forward. The shift had already been long when Ethan opened the next case file. Fatigue sat quietly in the back of his mind, held in place by routine and discipline. He scanned the notes the way he always did, efficiently and without emotion. Age. Medical history. Current condition. Then he reached the name. He stopped reading. For a moment, the hospital sounds faded. The steady hum of machines, the distant footsteps in the hallway, the muted voices outside the office all seemed far away. The name on the file was one he had trained himself not to think about. One he had not spoken aloud in years. Laura. His breathing slowed as he read further. Years of addiction had taken their toll. Liver damage. Heart complications. Repeated infections. The body of someone who had lived hard and been worn down by time and neglect. The notes were clinical and detached, but the story behind them was not. Ethan leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes briefly. Recognition came instantly, sharp and undeniable. This was his mother. Not as he remembered her, but close enough that the truth could not be ignored. Protocol was clear. A surgeon was allowed to step away from operating on an immediate family member. In most cases, another qualified surgeon would take over. Ethan knew this. He had learned it early in his training. The rule existed to protect both patient and doctor. He checked the schedule. There was no one else. The surgery was complex and high risk. Timing mattered. Delaying it could mean permanent damage or death. The other senior surgeons were already committed to critical cases. Transferring the patient was not an option. The window was closing fast. Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle heavily in his chest. This was not the sudden emergency of the past. This was deliberate, documented, unavoidable. A choice. He stood and walked slowly to the window at the end of the hall. Outside, the city moved on without pause. Cars passed. People walked, laughed, hurried. The world did not know what decision waited behind hospital walls. For years, Ethan had believed distance was strength. He had built his life carefully, separating who he was from where he came from. That separation had protected him. Now it was being tested. He returned to the file and read it again, forcing himself to focus on facts instead of memory. The patient required skill, precision, and calm judgment. Emotion would only get in the way. If he stepped aside, she might not survive. If he stayed, he would have to face everything he had locked away. A nurse knocked gently on the door, asking if he was ready to proceed. Ethan nodded, his expression neutral. He did not explain. There was no time. When Laura was brought in for pre-operative preparation, she did not recognize him. Her eyes were tired, unfocused, clouded by medication and years of damage. She looked smaller than he remembered. Fragile in a way that stirred no satisfaction, only a quiet heaviness. She read his name badge briefly and looked away. There was no reaction. No recognition. Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Being unseen was familiar. It hurt less than he expected. As the team prepared, Ethan gave instructions with steady clarity. His voice did not waver. His movements were precise. To anyone watching, this was just another difficult case handled by a skilled surgeon. Inside, the past pressed close. He remembered nights of fear, words that cut deep, and the feeling of being unwanted. He remembered hunger, silence, and broken promises. He also remembered leaving, the relief and guilt tangled together. All of it existed now alongside the present moment. When the surgery began, Ethan narrowed his focus. Each step demanded attention. The body before him was no longer his mother. It was a patient in need of care. He worked methodically, adjusting when complications arose, making decisions quickly and calmly. The surgery tested him in ways few others ever had. Physical difficulty blended with emotional strain. There were moments when the risk increased, when outcomes were uncertain. Each time, Ethan chose action over hesitation. Hours passed. When the final steps were complete and the patient stabilized, a quiet settled over the room. The team moved efficiently, exhausted but relieved. Ethan stepped back, removing his gloves, his hands steady until the very end. Only when he left the operating room did the weight return. He stood in the hallway, leaning lightly against the wall, allowing himself a single deep breath. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel relief. What he felt was clarity. Later, as Laura was moved to recovery, she briefly opened her eyes. Ethan was nearby, finishing notes. She looked at him, studying his face with vague curiosity. "Are you the doctor?" she asked weakly. He nodded. Yes. She did not ask his name again. She thanked him quietly and drifted back to sleep. That was all. Ethan did not stay longer than necessary. He transferred care as soon as another surgeon was available and returned to his routine. He did not visit again. He did not leave a note. Closure, he realized, did not always come with words. When he called Margaret later, his voice was calm. He told her what had happened. She listened, just as she always had, without interruption. "You did what you were meant to do," she said softly. "Nothing more. Nothing less." That night, Ethan slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The past no longer pressed against him the way it once had. It had not disappeared, but it had lost its power. He understood something important now. Healing did not mean avoiding difficult moments. It meant facing them without losing yourself. The patient no one expected had come and gone. The decision he made was not about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about integrity. About choosing who he was, even when the choice was painful. When Ethan returned to work, he did so unchanged in the ways that mattered. Calm. Focused. Compassionate. But beneath that calm was a deeper strength. He no longer needed distance to feel safe. He had built something stronger than avoidance. He had built himself. And that, he knew, was enough. Ethan stood outside the room longer than necessary. The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before something important. He could hear the steady rhythm of machines through the door, measuring breaths, counting time. He rested one hand against the cool wall and reminded himself why he was here. Not as a son. As a surgeon. When he entered, Laura lay small beneath white sheets. The years had changed her. Her face was thinner, her skin pale, marked by illness and exhaustion. She looked fragile in a way that stirred no anger, only a distant ache. Her eyes were half open, unfocused at first. Then they settled on him. She studied his face carefully, as if searching through fog. Recognition came slowly, and when it did, it carried weight. Her eyes widened slightly. Her breathing changed. Fear mixed with something deeper. "Ethan," she said, her voice weak but certain. He nodded once. He did not step closer. He did not reach for her hand. He stood where he was, steady and controlled. In that moment, years of memory pressed forward, but he did not let them take over. Tears filled her eyes. Shame followed quickly, visible in the way her face tightened. She opened her mouth as if to speak, to explain, to apologize. Whatever words she meant to say never came. Her strength faded, and the moment slipped away. There was no time for conversations about the past. No space for apologies that came too late. The monitors continued their quiet work, indifferent to emotion. The surgery window was closing. Ethan spoke calmly, explaining the procedure in simple terms, just as he would with any patient. He did not mention their relationship. He did not soften his words or harden them. He offered facts, risks, and reassurance without false promises. She listened, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. When he finished, she nodded weakly. Trust in that moment came not from history, but from the calm certainty in his voice. As the team prepared to move her, Laura looked at him one last time. Her lips trembled. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Ethan paused for only a second. He did not respond with forgiveness or rejection. He simply acknowledged her words with a small nod. The past did not need to be resolved here. This moment was about survival. In the operating room, everything narrowed to focus and precision. Lights overhead. Clean instruments. Familiar motions. Ethan took his place without hesitation. The personal history dissolved into professional clarity. He worked with care and discipline, each movement deliberate. Complications arose, as expected in a case this severe. He adjusted calmly, guiding the team through each challenge. His voice remained steady. His hands did not shake. What guided him was not resentment or obligation. It was something quieter and stronger. The values Margaret had lived by. Consistency. Responsibility. Doing the right thing even when it was hard. Hours passed in controlled intensity. When the final steps were complete and Laura was stabilized, a quiet sense of completion settled over the room. The team moved efficiently, tired but composed. Ethan stepped back, removing his gloves, his expression unchanged. He had done his job. Afterward, he stood alone for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle. He did not feel victory. He did not feel release. What he felt was alignment. The man he had become matched the choice he had made. He did not return to Laura's bedside. He transferred care and stepped away, respecting the boundary he had earned. Saving her life did not require reopening wounds or rewriting history. Later, when he spoke with Margaret, he told her simply that the surgery was successful. She did not ask for details. She did not need them. "I knew you would do the right thing," she said. Ethan understood then that closure did not come from words exchanged or apologies given. It came from acting in line with who you chose to be. Facing the woman who hurt him did not undo the past. But it proved something important. Pain did not define him. Discipline did. Compassion did. Choice did. He had saved her life not as a son seeking peace, but as a man honoring the foundation built for him long ago. And when he returned to his work, he carried no bitterness with him. Only the quiet strength of someone who had faced the hardest moment of his life and remained whole. Laura survived the surgery. The hospital records marked it as a success, another life pulled back from the edge. Recovery would be long and uncertain, shaped by years of damage that could not be undone. Ethan read the updates once, then stepped away. His role was finished. He did not visit her room. He did not leave a message. Survival did not require connection. Some people expected more. A reunion. A conversation. An emotional ending where wounds finally closed. Ethan understood why they might think that way. But forgiveness, as he had learned, did not always look like togetherness. It did not require reopening doors that had been closed for good reason. For him, forgiveness meant freedom. It meant no longer carrying anger like a weight in his chest. It meant refusing to let the past dictate his present choices. Saving Laura's life had not been an act of reconciliation. It had been an act of integrity. He had done what his values demanded, nothing more and nothing less. Ethan returned to his routine quickly. Long shifts. Quiet focus. Patients who needed steady hands and clear minds. His work grounded him. Every case reminded him why he chose this path. He treated each patient with the same care, the same patience, the same respect. No exceptions. A few days later, he drove out to see Margaret. Her house looked the same as it always had. Familiar. Steady. Safe. The porch light was on, even though it was still early evening. She greeted him with a warm smile and a quiet hug. They sat at the kitchen table, sharing a simple meal. Conversation flowed easily, touching on small details before settling into silence. The kind of silence that did not need filling. After a while, Ethan spoke. He thanked her. Not just for being there now, but for everything she had done years ago. For fighting through paperwork and doubt. For opening her home. For choosing him when it would have been easier not to. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she reached across the table and rested her hand over his. She reminded him of something important. Saving his mother's life did not erase the past. It did not change what had happened or excuse it. What it proved was that he had risen above it. That he had become someone guided by principle rather than pain. Ethan felt the truth of her words settle deeply. He did not need validation from the past. He had built his own foundation. They talked a little longer, then sat quietly, watching the evening fade. There was no dramatic conclusion, no final lesson spoken aloud. Just understanding. When Ethan left, he felt lighter than he had in a long time. Not because everything was resolved, but because he no longer needed it to be. He returned to his life with clarity. His work continued. His routines held. The path ahead remained demanding, but it was his. Forgiveness, he understood now, was not about forgetting or reconnecting. It was about choosing not to be controlled by what had hurt you. Ethan's story did not end with where he came from. It moved forward with who he chose to become. And every day he stepped into the hospital, calm and focused, he lived that choice again. Not defined by a broken childhood. Not shaped by neglect. Defined by discipline, compassion, and the quiet strength to choose a better way.